Part 1. In 1497, John Cabot sailed to North America under the English flag, marking an early step for a small island kingdom that was then an unremarkable power in Europe. Within a few centuries, this nation would come to rule a quarter of the world's land and people, a feat achieved through a blend of determination, opportunity, and often violence. This vast historical narrative evokes a range of contrasting images: soldiers enduring harsh climates, ships laden with exotic spices, the momentous announcements of independence crackling over radios, and the serene scenes of cricket being played from the Caribbean beaches to the fields of South Asia. For some, this history represents a pinnacle of achievement, pointing to lasting legacies such as railway systems, parliamentary structures, and judicial courts that continue to function today. Conversely, for others, it stands as a stark symbol of profound displacement, widespread exploitation, and severe cultural disruption. Both of these perspectives, despite their apparent opposition, contain elements of truth. This unprecedented global dominance was not the result of a meticulously crafted master plan. Rather, Britain largely stumbled into its position of power, driven primarily by the forces of private enterprise. It was a remarkable transformation where a mere trading company evolved into the de facto ruler of millions of people. Pirates, once figures of rebellion and outlawry, ascended to the esteemed ranks of admirals. Small, isolated outposts gradually expanded and coalesced into vast dominions that spanned entire continents. When this immense empire finally came to an end, it did so not with a dramatic, cataclysmic collapse, but through a series of ceremonial flag lowerings, a more understated, yet equally significant conclusion. What it left in its wake were numerous nations, many of which now speak English and practice parliamentary democracy, yet importantly, define their modern identities often in deliberate opposition to their former ruler. This sprawling story, which stretches across many centuries and encompasses multiple continents, serves as a profound testament to the human capacity for both extraordinary achievement and significant failure, leaving behind enduring infrastructure that still stands tall alongside deep-seated scars that have yet to fully heal. The very foundations of what would ultimately become the largest empire in recorded history were laid not through military conquest, but through the seemingly more innocuous channels of commerce. Part 2. In 1373, a pivotal alliance was forged between the Kingdom of England and Portugal, a relationship that has remarkably endured to this very day, making it the oldest continuous diplomatic partnership in European history. This accord, formerly known as the Treaty of London, was signed by King Edward III of England and King Ferdinand and Queen Eleonora of Portugal. Its initial purpose was primarily to act as a counterweight to the burgeoning power of Castile. However, over time, this political agreement evolved significantly, transforming into a crucial commercial partnership. Through the vital connections established by this treaty, merchants hailing from the British Isles gained invaluable access to Portuguese maritime knowledge. This access came at a particularly opportune moment, as European powers were increasingly directing their gaze towards distant horizons, driven by the spirit of exploration and the allure of new trade routes. During the medieval period, Britain itself showed very little indication of any future imperial ambitions. The Tudor monarchs of this era were largely preoccupied with various continental wars and persistent internal conflicts, and their primary focus remained firmly on consolidating power within their own island realm. For instance, the 100 Years' War with France significantly drained the royal coffers, leaving the treasury depleted. Concurrently, the devastating Wars of the Roses inflicted immense damage upon the English nobility, further weakening the kingdom internally. When Henry Tudor finally defeated Richard III at Bosworth Field in 1485, a victory that established the enduring Tudor dynasty, his realm was still considered a peripheral European power, holding only modest international significance. Similarly, maritime ambition remained rather modest during these nascent years. While the prominent maritime powers of Spain and Portugal had, with papal blessing, divided the non-European world between themselves through the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas. The Tudor monarchy primarily concentrated its efforts on defending its own shores and diligently maintaining its traditional and lucrative wool trade with Flanders. Part 3. Yet, beneath this apparent caution, a restless ambition gradually began to stir within the island nation. Perched strategically at Europe's western edge, Britain possessed inherent natural advantages for seafaring endeavors. No point within the realm lay more than 70 miles from the coast, and its numerous natural harbors provided ample shelter for its steadily growing merchant fleets. The late 15th century ushered in dramatic shifts in European power dynamics. Christopher Columbus's groundbreaking 1492 voyage for Spain opened up vast American horizons, while Portuguese navigators successfully established direct sea routes to India by circumnavigating Africa. These monumental developments posed a significant threat, as they promised to bypass the traditional Mediterranean and overland trade routes upon which British merchants had long relied. Continental European powers were rapidly claiming vast territories across the oceans, raising the specter of Britain's isolation from these emerging global trade networks. Henry VII, the shrewd founder of the Tudor dynasty, recognized the immense potential inherent in Atlantic exploration. Although cautious by nature, this pragmatic monarch nevertheless possessed a keen understanding of commercial opportunity. In 1497, he commissioned John Cabot, Giovanni Caboto, a Venetian navigator, to embark on a quest to find western passages to Asia's fabled riches. Sailing in his tiny vessel, the Matthew, with a mere 18 crew members, Cabot successfully reached Newfoundland, claiming these new territories for the English crown and thereby establishing the very first British claim in North America. This marked a modest, almost inconspicuous, beginning for what would eventually burgeon into a global empire. Although Cabot's discoveries initially disappointed those who had hoped for immediate access to Asian wealth, they nonetheless revealed incredibly rich fishing grounds off the coast of Newfoundland. By the early 16th century, fishing fleets from Bristol and other English ports were making regular seasonal voyages to harvest the abundant cod, drying their catch on the shorelines before making the return journey home. These humble fishing expeditions, seemingly insignificant at the time, quietly and effectively established a consistent British presence in North American waters. Part 4. Meanwhile, Spanish conquistadors were extracting vast mineral wealth from the conquered lands of Mexico and Peru, a reality that fueled considerable envy and ambition among Tudor subjects back in England. Tales of the immense Aztec and Inca gold circulated widely through London, eagerly stoking dreams of similar riches for the English. Simultaneously, a profound religious upheaval dramatically transformed Britain's relationship with the rest of Europe and consequently, its entire imperial trajectory. Henry VIII's decisive break with Rome in the 1530s cast his kingdom as a Protestant outsider among the predominantly Catholic powers of Europe. This theological schism carried profound geopolitical implications. Cut off from traditional Catholic alliance networks and facing the daunting prospect of potential crusades launched against it, the realm found itself in dire need of new defensive strategies. The dissolution of the monasteries, a monumental act, transferred vast amounts of wealth directly to the crown and, significantly, created a new landowning class. This class was eager for investment opportunities, including increasingly attractive overseas ventures. Following Henry's death in 1547, the realm experienced considerable religious whiplash. Edward VI's Protestant reforms gave way to Mary I's fervent Catholic restoration, during which hundreds of Protestants were brutally executed. When Elizabeth I ascended the throne in 1558, she inherited a vulnerable nation, perpetually threatened by powerful continental rivals, particularly Spain, which viewed the island kingdom as a heretical state ripe for invasion and recatholicization. Under these immense pressures, the Tudor monarchy assiduously cultivated naval strength as its primary means of defense, thereby initiating a maritime focus that would later prove crucial in supporting its imperial expansion. The relentless search for alternative trade routes intensified significantly during Elizabeth's reign. Part 5. Explorer Martin Frobisher launched 3 ambitious expeditions between 1576 and 1578. Tirelessly seeking the elusive Northwest Passage to Asia's lucrative markets. Navigating treacherous Arctic waters, Frobisher discovered what is now Frobisher Bay in Baffin Island, Canada. Although his voyages ultimately ended in financial disaster, as the ship holds, supposedly full of gold ore, proved to be worthless. They nonetheless demonstrated the islanders' unwavering willingness to risk both lives and capital in their persistent pursuit of commercial advantage. John Davis pushed even farther north in 3 subsequent voyages between 1585 and 1587, remarkably reaching 72 degrees north latitude. Both Frobisher and Davis failed to discover viable sea routes to Asia. However, their expeditions undeniably established a British presence in Arctic waters and, crucially, developed advanced navigational techniques for challenging environments. Their voyages vividly exemplified the intertwining of scientific inquiry, commercial ambition, and national pride that would profoundly characterize later imperial ventures. Meanwhile, continental constraints compelled Tudor entrepreneurs towards significant institutional innovation. The Muscovy Company, chartered in 1555 following Richard Chancellor's expedition to Russia, sought to establish overland connections to China through vast Russian territories. This joint stock corporation represented a crucial development in British commercial evolution, becoming the first major trading corporation and serving as a prototype for future imperial enterprises. Through this pioneering company, merchants learned to pool capital, share risks more effectively, and operate efficiently under royal charter in distant and often challenging lands, thereby establishing organizational templates that would later be employed globally. Anthony Jenkinson, a Muscovy Company agent, traveled extensively through Russia and into Persia during the 1660s, diligently seeking new trade routes to Central Asia. Though he never reached China, Jenkinson successfully established a commercial presence in regions previously dominated by Italian and Ottoman merchants. The company's modest successes unequivocally demonstrated the vast possibilities for trade beyond traditional European markets. Part 6. Even when lacking military might comparable to that of dominant continental powers, privateer captains like Francis Drake and John Hawkins perfectly embodied the Tudor monarchy's opportunistic approach to overseas expansion. Operating with royal blessing but with minimal official control, these audacious sailor entrepreneurs brazenly raided Spanish ships and settlements across the Atlantic. Drake's audacious raids on Spanish Pacific territories vividly demonstrated growing English maritime capability while simultaneously enriching his investors, including Queen Elizabeth herself. His circumnavigation of the globe between 1577 and 1580 brought back not only plunder but also invaluable geographic knowledge, elevating him from a mere pirate to a revered national hero through knighthood. Elizabeth's government meticulously maintained official deniability regarding privateer activities while secretly encouraging and actively investing in them. This shrewd approach, which effectively utilized private enterprise as an unofficial arm of state power, would reappear consistently throughout British imperial history. Drake and his contemporaries served as remarkably cost-effective naval auxiliaries, effectively disrupting Spanish shipping without requiring direct crown financing. Their substantial profits stimulated widespread interest in overseas ventures among the island's elites, thereby creating powerful constituencies that strongly favored continued maritime expansion. John Hawkins pioneered direct involvement in the Atlantic slave trade with 3 voyages between 1562 and 1569, brutally transporting enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies in the Caribbean. Hawkins's actions initiated British participation in the triangular trade, a system that would later expand dramatically in scale and human cost. His final voyage, however, ended in disaster at San Juan de Ulua, Mexico, when Spanish forces attacked his fleet, resulting in the deaths of many crew members. The young Francis Drake narrowly escaped this defeat, an experience that fueled an enduring hatred of Spain and subsequently powered his later, more aggressive raids. Part 7. While privateers relentlessly harassed Spanish shipping, other intrepid entrepreneurs initiated early colonization efforts. Sir Humphrey Gilbert received a patent in 1578 to establish North American settlements. After an initial failed expedition, Gilbert bravely claimed Newfoundland for the crown in 1583, but tragically drowned while returning home. His half-brother, Walter Raleigh, inherited both Gilbert's colonial ambitions and royal favor. The Roanoke colony represented the first serious attempt at permanent North American settlement. Under Raleigh's sponsorship and with Queen Elizabeth's explicit blessing, expeditions in 1585 attempted to establish a permanent presence on Roanoke Island, located in present-day North Carolina. The artist John White created remarkably detailed illustrations of indigenous peoples and the native flora and fauna, providing the first visual record of North American environments. However, the colony struggled severely with inadequate supplies and deteriorating relations with indigenous communities. When White returned to Britain for provisions, the Anglo-Spanish War delayed his return for 3 agonizing years. Upon finally reaching Roanoke in 1590, White discovered the settlement mysteriously abandoned. All 115 colonists had vanished, leaving behind only the enigmatic carving Croton on a post. This lost colony became an enduring mystery, with theories ranging from massacre to assimilation into indigenous communities. Despite its ultimate failure, Roanoke nonetheless set important precedents for future colonization efforts. The venture clearly demonstrated both the immense challenges inherent in overseas settlement and the unwavering determination to establish North American footholds despite significant setbacks. Richard Hakluyt's Discourse on Western Planting articulated early justifications for colonization, arguing that American settlements would provide vital markets for domestic goods, employment opportunities for the poor, and crucial strategic advantages against Spain. Hakluyt's influential writings represented emerging imperial ideologies that seamlessly combined economic opportunity, national security, and religious purpose. As a priest and scholar, Hakluyt presented colonization as both commercially advantageous and divinely sanctioned, portraying it as a Protestant mission explicitly designed to counter Catholic Spain's growing influence in the Americas. Part 8. The Anglo-Spanish rivalry reached its dramatic culmination in 1588 when Philip II of Spain launched his Invincible Armada, with the explicit aim of invading the island nation, deposing Elizabeth I, and restoring Catholicism. The Spanish assembled an immense fleet of 130 ships carrying 30,000 men, an overwhelming force when compared to Elizabeth's smaller navy. Yet, in the English Channel, her captains skillfully exploited their vessels' superior maneuverability and faster rate of fire. These smaller, more agile English ships decisively outfought the cumbersome Spanish fleet, aided significantly by fortuitous weather conditions that contemporaries famously dubbed the Protestant wind. Fire ships sent among the anchored Spanish vessels created widespread panic, scattering their formidable formation. The Spanish defeat profoundly transformed Britain's self-perception. Though largely a defensive victory, it strongly suggested divine favor for Protestantism against Catholic Spain, what contemporary pamphlets described as God's protection of a chosen nation. Naval technology, tactics, and national confidence all advanced significantly, laying crucial foundations for future maritime dominance. Naval commanders like Drake, Hawkins, and Martin Frobisher attained near-mythic status in the popular imagination, forging deep cultural associations between national identity and maritime prowess that would persist for centuries. Elizabeth's reign also witnessed early experiments with colonization in Ireland, which served as a grim laboratory for imperial practices later employed globally. Her government established plantations in Munster and later Ulster, systematically displacing native Irish populations and importing loyal Protestant settlers from Britain. This strategic approach, conquest, displacement, and plantation, would tragically repeat across other continents. Ireland thus became the first colony where methods of control through cultural suppression, land appropriation, and population management were refined and institutionalized. The Irish experience introduced concepts that would later become central to imperial governance, including civilizing missions to justify conquest, distinct legal frameworks that differentiated natives from settlers, and administrative structures designed for controlling territories beyond traditional borders. Part 9. Writers like Edmund Spenser, who actively participated in the Munster plantation, developed elaborate justifications for displacing barbarous peoples. Rhetoric that would later be conveniently applied to indigenous populations worldwide. Ireland thus served as both a testing ground and a template for the subjugation of diverse populations. As the 16th century drew to a close, growing commercial interests increasingly demanded a more formalized institutional structure. On December 31, 1600, Queen Elizabeth I granted a royal charter to the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies, commonly known as the East India Company. Created merely to compete in the highly lucrative spice trade against formidable Dutch and Portuguese rivals. This joint stock corporation would eventually administer vast territories and command armies larger than Britain's own, effectively becoming the primary vehicle of British power in Asia. The East India Company's charter perfectly exemplified the public-private partnership that was characteristic of early imperialism. The Crown granted monopoly trading rights and limited legal autonomy, while merchants provided the necessary capital and assumed the considerable financial risks. Few present at its founding could have possibly imagined that this seemingly modest commercial enterprise would transform into history's most remarkable corporate empire, eventually governing hundreds of millions of subjects across the Indian subcontinent. Unlike Spain's conquest-centered imperialism, the Tudor approach to overseas involvement remained primarily commercial and opportunistic rather than explicitly territorial throughout the 16th century. Spanish conquistadors relentlessly sought gold, glory, and God, establishing vast viceroyalties administered directly by crown officials. By contrast, the British established scattered trading posts rather than conquered provinces. They primarily sought profit rather than religious conversion or large-scale settlement. And they relied heavily on private initiative rather than centralized state planning. This pragmatic, commerce-driven approach would characterize much of British imperial expansion in subsequent centuries, fundamentally distinguishing it from the more centralized European empires. Part 10. The Tudor state, lacking the extensive resources necessary for direct colonial administration, shrewdly leveraged private enterprise through various mechanisms such as charters, patents, and privateering commissions. This approach effectively distributed costs and risks while allowing for considerable flexibility, though it sometimes resulted in conflicting directives and inconsistent policies. As Elizabeth's reign concluded in 1603, her kingdom possessed no formal colonies beyond Ireland. It controlled no significant overseas territories and maintained only tenuous footholds in international trade networks that were then dominated by other European powers. Yet, crucial elements for future expansion were now firmly in place: a steadily growing naval capability, experienced maritime leaders, robust institutional frameworks for commercial ventures, and a burgeoning national confidence fostered by successful survival against continental threats. These ingredients, combined with a strong Protestant entrepreneurial energy and intense commercial rivalries, created the fertile conditions for unprecedented imperial growth in the century ahead. The death of Queen Elizabeth I marked not just the end of the Tudor dynasty but also the significant transition from a defensive, insular realm to an increasingly confident and expansive Britain. The seeds of empire had been meticulously planted, though none at the time could possibly foresee the global dominion they would eventually yield. The passing of Elizabeth and the accession of James VI of Scotland to the English throne as James I in 1603 marked the definitive beginning of a new imperial era. Under this first Stuart monarch, tentative overseas ventures began to transform into more deliberate colonial enterprises. Having united the crowns of England and Scotland, James proudly styled himself King of Great Britain. Though a formal political union remained a century away, this new composite identity, however awkward in its early form, would ultimately become the banner under which a global empire later expanded. Part 11. Early 17th century colonization differed markedly from modern conceptions of empire. Rather than state-directed conquest, colonial ventures operated primarily through chartered companies and proprietary grants to wealthy individuals. The Virginia Company of London exemplified this approach. Granted a royal charter in 1606. The company aimed to establish profitable settlements in North America while extending British influence across the Atlantic. Jamestown, founded May 1607 on a peninsula along the James River, represented the first permanent European settlement in North America under the English Crown's authority. The colony's early years proved disastrous. Chosen for defensibility rather than agricultural potential, the swampy location fostered widespread disease. Relations with the powerful Powhatan Confederacy alternated between uneasy trade and violent conflict. Starvation claimed numerous lives during the starving time of 1609 to 1610, reducing the population from roughly 500 to a mere 60 settlers. Rumors of cannibalism, later confirmed by archaeological evidence, vividly illustrated the desperate conditions these early colonists faced. The Virginia colony survived largely through two crucial adaptations. First, under the stern leadership of Captain John Smith, who famously declared that, "He who does not work shall not eat." The settlement imposed military discipline on formerly Gentile colonists unaccustomed to manual labor. Second, and more significantly, the discovery that tobacco could be profitably cultivated transformed economic prospects. By 1614, Virginia tobacco began arriving in London's ports, launching a lucrative trade that ensured the colony's commercial viability. Tobacco cultivation dramatically reshaped Virginia's society. The labor-intensive crop required more workers than migration from the homeland alone could supply. Initially, this need was met through indentured servitude, with poor laborers from the British Isles exchanging 4 to 7 years of work for passage to America and land thereafter. As demand grew, colonial leaders turned increasingly toward African labor. Though the legal distinction between servitude and slavery remained initially fluid, by mid-century, racial bondage began hardening into a hereditary institution. Part 12. The arrival of approximately 20 enslaved Africans aboard a Dutch vessel at Point Comfort in August 1619 marked a pivotal moment in North American history. Though initially treated similarly to indentured servants, these individuals represented the vanguard of a labor system that would fundamentally shape colonial development. Within decades, permanent racial slavery emerged as the dominant form of plantation labor, laying foundations for centuries of exploitation and resistance. That same year witnessed another crucial development for Virginia's future, the establishment of the House of Burgesses, the first representative assembly in the American colonies. Though limited to property-owning men, this assembly established precedents for self-government that would characterize settlements throughout North America. This seemingly paradoxical combination, democratic institutions for white colonists alongside intensifying racial bondage, exemplified contradictions that would persist throughout the imperial project. By mid-century, the British North American foothold expanded considerably. Massachusetts Bay Colony, established by Puritans seeking religious autonomy from the Anglican Church, grew rapidly after its founding in 1630. Unlike Virginia's scattered plantations, Massachusetts developed around town-centered communities where religious conformity was strictly enforced. Within decades, settlements spread throughout New England, establishing distinctive regional cultures that would persist for centuries. Unlike the Spanish emphasis on extracting precious metals from their American possessions, these new British colonies focused primarily on agricultural exports and maritime commerce. This economic orientation fostered different colonial societies, less dominated by royal officials and more characterized by local governance and commercial opportunities for the colonists themselves. While Spain's empire remained highly centralized, these expanding British territories developed substantial autonomy, laying groundwork for later tensions with the mother country. Caribbean colonization proceeded simultaneously with North American ventures. Barbados, claimed for the crown in 1625, initially relied on small farms worked by European settlers and servants. Part 13. The introduction of sugar cultivation in the 1640s dramatically transformed the island of Barbados. Drawing from Dutch experience in Brazil, Barbadian planters adopted labor-intensive sugar production methods that demanded far more workers than white immigration alone could provide. By 1660, the island had imported thousands of enslaved Africans, establishing the plantation model that would later be replicated throughout the Caribbean. Sugar production proved to be immensely profitable. Barbados, a mere 21 miles long by 14 miles wide, became one of the wealthiest colonies in the empire, generating enormous returns for absentee planters who frequently returned home to England after making their fortunes. The human cost, however, proved equally enormous. Brutal working conditions, rampant tropical diseases, and inadequate nutrition resulted in appalling mortality rates among enslaved laborers, necessitating the continuous importation of enslaved Africans to maintain workforce numbers. Jamaica significantly expanded British Caribbean holdings when Admiral William Penn and General Robert Venables captured the island from Spain in 1655. Though originally tasked with attacking Hispaniola, their forces suffered a defeat there before successfully seizing the lightly defended Jamaica. Despite initial disappointment with this consolation prize, Jamaica eventually developed into the most valuable Caribbean possession, its sugar plantations generating immense wealth through enslaved labor. Naval rivalry with the Dutch profoundly shaped imperial development throughout the mid-17th century. 3 Anglo-Dutch wars between 1652 and 1674 contested commercial supremacy and colonial possessions. During these conflicts, the Navigation Acts of 1651 and 1660 aimed to secure trade advantages by requiring colonial goods to be shipped on vessels registered in the kingdom, or those belonging to the producing country. These protectionist measures specifically targeted Dutch shipping dominance and bound colonies more tightly to metropolitan economic interests. Part 14. One significant result of the Anglo-Dutch conflict came in 1664 when forces under the Duke of York seized New Netherland, renaming it New York after the Duke himself, who later became King James II. This acquisition secured a strategically valuable territory between New England and the Chesapeake colonies while adding diverse populations, Dutch, Swedish, German, and various African and indigenous peoples, to the growing ranks of imperial subjects. The relatively peaceful conquest demonstrated how European colonial rivalries often determined territorial control with little regard for non-European inhabitants. Overseas expansion continued despite significant domestic turmoil in Britain. The English Civil Wars, the execution of Charles I in 1649, Oliver Cromwell's Protectorate, and the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II in 1660 all occurred amid continuous colonial growth. This pattern illustrated how imperial development often proceeded through private enterprise despite political upheavals at home. While the state's involvement in colonization fluctuated with changing regimes, merchants, planters, and settlers maintained expanding commercial networks. The Restoration period saw systematic development of imperial administration. The Duke of York received proprietorship of New York. William Penn established Pennsylvania as a Quaker colony in 1681. Carolina, granted to 8 lords proprietors in 1663, developed plantation agriculture in its southern regions while its northern areas relied more on small farms and naval stores. These proprietary colonies, though owing allegiance to the crown, operated under substantial control of their proprietors, creating varied governance models throughout the American colonies. Royal oversight increased during this period. The Navigation Acts gained stricter enforcement. The Lords of Trade, established in 1675, and later the Lords of Trade and Plantations, developed as specialized bodies overseeing colonial affairs. Colonial policies increasingly reflected mercantile principles, aiming to extract maximum economic benefit for the mother country while preventing colonial manufacturing that might compete with home industries. Part 15. The foundation of the Royal African Company in 1672 formalized British participation in the Atlantic slave trade under royal monopoly, granted exclusive rights to trade with Africa. The company annually transported thousands of enslaved Africans to American plantations. When its monopoly ended in 1698, independent traders entered the traffic, dramatically increasing the volume of human cargo. By the early 18th century, slave traders flying the Union Jack dominated the transatlantic slave trade, eventually transporting over 3 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, more than any other European nation. Alongside Atlantic developments, British commercial interests expanded in Asia through the East India Company. Initially focused on acquiring spices, company agents established trading posts at Surat in 1613 and Madras in 1639. Unlike their aggressive Portuguese and Dutch competitors, the company initially relied on diplomacy rather than military force, diligently securing trading privileges from local rulers. The company established Fort William at Kolkata in 1696, creating another foothold that would later become a significant center of British power in India. Competition with the French East India Company intensified throughout this period. Both nations sought commercial advantages through alliances with local Indian powers rather than direct territorial control. This approach reflected the reality that European military forces remained relatively small compared to powerful Indian states like the Mughal Empire. The company operated primarily as a trading enterprise, though it increasingly required armed factories and vessels to protect its commerce from European rivals and local interference. Indigenous resistance shaped colonial development throughout distant territories. In North America, the Anglo-Powhatan Wars in Virginia, King Philip's War in New England, and numerous smaller conflicts demonstrated Native American determination to resist encroachment. These wars resulted in significant casualties on both sides, but ultimately facilitated colonial expansion through treaties that transferred land to European settlements. Part 16. The colonists' growing numerical advantage, combined with devastating epidemics among indigenous populations, gradually shifted power balances. King Philip's War vividly illustrated these dynamics. Between 1675 and 1678, a coalition of indigenous nations led by Metacom, whom the colonists called King Philip, bravely challenged New England's relentless expansion. The conflict resulted in proportionately more deaths than any subsequent American war, decimating native populations while destroying numerous colonial towns. Though ultimately defeated, Metacom's fierce resistance temporarily halted frontier expansion and powerfully demonstrated the indigenous opposition that colonization consistently encountered. Religious and ethnic diversity characterized these emerging colonies despite official preferences for Anglican conformity. Puritans dominated New England. Catholics found refuge in Maryland until Protestant majorities restricted their rights. Quakers established Pennsylvania as a haven for persecuted religious minorities. Jewish communities established synagogues in Newport, New York, and Charleston. Various Protestant dissenters, Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, established congregations throughout the colonies. This religious pluralism, though often contested, distinguished these British possessions from the more religiously homogeneous Spanish Empire. Colonial governance blended metropolitan control with local autonomy. Royal governors represented crown authority but required cooperation from colonial assemblies that controlled local taxation and expenditures. This inherent tension between imperial oversight and self-government created ongoing negotiations of power. Colonial elites developed increasing confidence in their right to manage internal affairs while acknowledging sovereign authority in foreign relations and trade regulation. These arrangements established crucial precedents for later conflicts over the precise boundaries of imperial authority. Bacon's rebellion in Virginia during 1676 to 1677 highlighted severe social tensions within maturing colonies. Led by Nathaniel Bacon against Governor William Berkeley. The uprising began as a dispute over Native American policy, but evolved into a broader challenge to elite governance. Part 17. Frontier settlers, indentured servants, and small farmers temporarily seized power, even burning Jamestown before royal forces ultimately restored order. In its aftermath, Virginia's elite increasingly favored enslaved African labor over European indentured servants, partially as a strategy to prevent future cross-racial alliances among the laboring classes. Imperial reforms followed the Glorious Revolution of 1688 to 1689, which replaced James II with William and Mary. The new monarchs approved Massachusetts's new charter in 1691, which absorbed Plymouth Colony and established more direct royal control while maintaining a degree of self-government. Similar arrangements in other colonies created a patchwork imperial system that skillfully balanced metropolitan oversight with colonial traditions of local autonomy, thereby creating governance models distinct from the more centralized Spanish and French empires. The 1690s witnessed the beginning of imperial warfare that would continue intermittently for over a century. King William's War, the North American extension of the War of the League of Augsburg, initiated colonial involvement in broader European conflicts. French and Allied Native American forces raided New England frontier settlements, while colonial militias attacked French positions in Canada. These conflicts established enduring patterns of frontier warfare where European imperial rivalries intertwined with indigenous alliances and local territorial ambitions. While establishing Atlantic colonies, British imperial ambitions also expanded into the Mediterranean. The acquisition of Tangier through Catherine of Braganza's dowry in 1661 provided a naval base controlling the Strait of Gibraltar, though it was abandoned in 1684 due to high maintenance costs. More lastingly, Gibraltar itself fell to Anglo-Dutch forces in 1704 during the War of Spanish Succession. This strategic acquisition, retained in subsequent peace treaties, secured British influence at the Mediterranean's entrance, and became a powerful symbol of naval power. Part 18. Scotland's failed imperial venture dramatically altered constitutional arrangements within the British Isles. The Company of Scotland, established in 1695, attempted to establish a colony at Darien on the Isthmus of Panama. This ambitious enterprise, absorbing between a quarter and half of Scotland's available capital, collapsed disastrously by 1700 due to disease, Spanish hostility, and obstruction from London. The financial catastrophe significantly weakened Scottish resistance to political union with England, contributing profoundly to the 1707 Act of Union that created Great Britain as a unified state. This Act of Union transformed the nature of empire by creating a truly British rather than simply English imperial project. Scottish merchants, soldiers, administrators, and settlers subsequently participated enthusiastically in imperial expansion, often disproportionately to Scotland's population. The Union increased human and financial resources while reducing potential continental interference through Scotland. Though initially controversial in both countries, the Union created a more powerful imperial state capable of challenging French global ambitions. By 1707, when England and Scotland formally united, the Crown possessed a scattered but valuable collection of overseas territories. The Atlantic colonies comprised a diverse assemblage. Sugar islands in the Caribbean generating enormous wealth through enslaved labor, North American settlements exporting tobacco, rice, furs, and fish while developing distinctive political traditions. Trading posts along Africa's coast facilitating the slave trade, and the beginnings of commercial footholds in India, though lacking the territorial extent of Spanish America. These possessions laid crucial foundations for unprecedented imperial expansion in the century ahead. The first century of British colonization established patterns that would characterize the empire throughout its existence. Private enterprise generally preceded state involvement. Commercial interests drove expansion more than strategic planning. Racial hierarchies emerged to justify the exploitation of non-European peoples. Part 19. Colonial governance combined metropolitan authority with local autonomy. Religious pluralism flourished despite official preferences. Indigenous resistance shaped development throughout imperial territories. These defining features, established during this formative period, would evolve but never entirely disappear as the empire expanded globally in subsequent centuries. The Act of Union in 1707 forged a newly unified kingdom ready to challenge European rivals on the global stage. The formal merger of England and Scotland created not just a unified domestic market, but a combined overseas project with expanded human and financial resources. Queen Anne now ruled a realm of approximately 8.5 million people with territories stretching from North America to India. Though still smaller than France in population and military strength, the United Kingdom possessed crucial advantages in this age of competition: naval supremacy, commercial expertise, and financial innovation. The Royal Navy emerged as the primary instrument of power. Following naval reforms under Charles II, the fleet had grown in both size and professionalism. By Anne's reign, maritime dominance had become central to strategic thinking. The capture of Gibraltar and Minorca secured Mediterranean bases that projected power far beyond home waters. Naval vessels not only fought opposing fleets but also protected merchant shipping, bombarded coastal fortifications, transported troops, and conducted diplomacy with distant rulers. Financial innovation proved equally crucial to success. The Bank of England, established in 1694, provided stable credit mechanisms that funded naval expansion and military operations. The development of national debt, managed through a sinking fund system, allowed the government to borrow unprecedented sums at lower interest rates than continental rivals. Meanwhile, London's insurance markets, stock exchange, and banking houses created sophisticated financial tools that mobilized private capital for overseas ventures. This financial revolution, more than military might alone, underpinned Britain's global ambitions. Part 20. The War of Spanish Succession highlighted these emerging advantages. While continental allies provided most land forces, the Royal Navy secured vital victories at sea. Admiral Rooke's capture of Gibraltar proved an enduring strategic gain. North American expeditions targeted French Canada and Spanish Florida, though with limited success. The Treaty of Utrecht delivered significant prizes. Gibraltar and Minorca remained in British hands, while Spain granted the valuable Asiento contract, the right to supply 4,800 enslaved Africans annually to Spanish America. The Asiento dramatically expanded British involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. The South Sea Company, formed specifically to exploit this contract, joined the Royal African Company and numerous independent traders in trafficking humans across the Atlantic. By the 1720s, vessels flying the Union Jack carried more enslaved Africans than those of any other nation. Liverpool, Bristol, and London developed into major slaving ports where merchants amassed fortunes through this brutal commerce. Between 1700 and 1800, ships transported roughly 2.5 million enslaved Africans to plantations in the Americas with horrific mortality rates during the infamous Middle Passage. Trade expanded dramatically following Utrecht. The triangular commerce between Europe, Africa, and the Americas generated immense wealth. Manufactured goods sent to Africa were exchanged for enslaved people, who were then transported to plantation regions producing sugar, tobacco, and other tropical commodities for European markets. A parallel exchange saw North American fish, lumber, and agricultural products traded for Caribbean sugar and molasses, which supplied a growing rum industry. These complex commercial patterns bound distant territories together in intricate networks of exploitation and exchange. The Navigation Acts strictly structured this commercial system. These laws, refined through multiple revisions, required overseas trade to pass through metropolitan ports on ships owned and largely crewed by subjects of the Crown, while often evaded through smuggling. These restrictions nevertheless directed commerce toward London and other domestic ports, creating jobs for sailors, longshoremen, warehouse workers, and shipbuilders. Part 21. Tropical products fueled growing manufacturing industries in Britain, while overseas territories provided captive markets for metropolitan textiles, metal goods, and other manufactured products. Sugar dominated this mercantile system in value. West Indian plantations in Jamaica, Barbados, and the Leeward Islands produced extraordinary wealth for absentee planters who often returned home to purchase landed estates and parliamentary seats, signifying their elevated social status. These Caribbean islands, though small in territory, generated greater revenue than the more populous mainland settlements in North America. Jamaica alone produced more wealth than all 13 North American territories combined. This prosperity, however, came at a devastating human cost. The sugar economy literally consumed enslaved lives, requiring constant new imports of enslaved Africans due to horrific mortality rates caused by brutal labor, disease, and malnutrition. North American territories, meanwhile, developed diverse economies. New England specialized in shipbuilding, fishing, and maritime trade, including significant commerce with the French and Spanish Caribbean. The Middle Colonies produced grain, timber, and livestock. The Chesapeake region specialized in tobacco, while the Carolinas exported rice, indigo, and naval stores such as pitch and tar. Georgia, established as a buffer against Spanish Florida, initially prohibited slavery, but abandoned this restriction as plantation agriculture spread southward. Populations grew rapidly through both natural increase and immigration. Non-English Europeans, Germans, Scots-Irish, Dutch, French Huguenots, and others, established communities throughout the mainland colonies. Forced migration of enslaved Africans dramatically altered demographics, particularly in southern plantation regions. Black populations outnumbered whites in South Carolina and approached half the population in Virginia. Indigenous peoples remained majority populations beyond coastal settlement zones, but faced increasing pressure as European settlements expanded westward. Part 22. The East India Company simultaneously expanded operations in South Asia. Following the death of Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb, central authority in India weakened significantly, creating opportune conditions for European commercial expansion. Company representatives diligently negotiated with regional powers for trading privileges, gradually developing political influence alongside their commercial activities. Robert Clive's pivotal victory at Plassey over the Nawab of Bengal transformed the company from a mere trader to a formidable territorial power, initiating a new phase of direct rule over millions of Indian subjects. International rivalry intensified throughout this period, with France emerging as the primary competitor. The War of Austrian Succession saw significant fighting in North America, known locally as King George's War. Local militias, supported by Royal Navy forces, captured the formidable French fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island, only to see it return to France in the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle. Such diplomatic compromises often frustrated Americans, who increasingly viewed conflicts through regional rather than purely European perspectives. The East India Company established a system of indirect rule in Bengal, initially maintaining the facade of Mughal authority. Company officials controlled revenue collection, trade regulation, and gradually, justice administration. The Diwani, or the right to collect revenue, granted by the Mughal emperor, legitimized this control. Company servants enriched themselves through private trade and lavish gifts from local authorities, while the company itself frequently struggled financially despite its vast territorial acquisitions. This stark contradiction between institutional poverty and individual enrichment characterized early British governance in India. The transformation from a commercial enterprise to a governing institution occurred unevenly and opportunistically rather than through deliberate, centralized planning. Military forces, initially maintained solely to protect trading posts, expanded into formidable armies that frequently intervened in local succession disputes, usually backing candidates who offered favorable trading terms. Part 23. Company territory grew through a combination of military conquest, treaties with local rulers, and legal agreements with weakening Mughal authorities. This piecemeal expansion created significant administrative challenges that the trading company was ill-equipped to address effectively. The 7 Years' War represented a crucial turning point in global British expansion, though ostensibly fought over European dynastic issues. The conflict rapidly evolved into a truly worldwide struggle for dominance. William Pitt the Elder, recognizing the immense commercial importance of overseas possessions, directed unprecedented resources toward distant theaters of conflict. His strategy emphasized robust naval power and aggressive campaigns abroad, while simultaneously providing substantial financial subsidies to European allies like Prussia to maintain continental pressure on France. North American fighting began even before formal declarations of war. Competing claims in the Ohio Valley led to early clashes between local militias and French forces. A young George Washington famously surrendered to French troops at Fort Necessity, while General Braddock's subsequent expedition ended in disastrous defeat. Initially, French forces and their indigenous allies dominated the conflict, capturing several key forts. However, the tide gradually turned as superior British naval power enabled the rapid transport of regular army regiments across the Atlantic. The conflict dramatically shifted power balances in North America. The capture of Louisbourg provided a crucial base for operations against Quebec, which eventually fell to General Wolfe's forces after a daring assault on the Plains of Abraham. Both Wolfe and his French counterpart, Montcalm, died in the battle. Montreal surrendered the following year, effectively ending French power in Canada. Meanwhile, British expeditions captured France's valuable Caribbean sugar islands, including Guadeloupe and Martinique, though some were later returned in peace negotiations. Part 24. Military forces made equally decisive gains in India. Robert Clive secured Bengal for the company, while Ercout defeated French forces under Comte de Lally at Wandiwash. The subsequent capture of Pondicherry effectively eliminated French power in South India. Unlike the temporary conquests of earlier conflicts, these victories produced lasting territorial changes. The Treaty of Paris formalized these gains, awarding Canada and eastern Louisiana to the British Crown while returning some Caribbean islands to France in exchange for other concessions. The 7 Years' War fundamentally transformed the extent and nature of British overseas holdings. The decisive defeat of France eliminated the primary rival for dominance in North America and India. Spanish participation late in the conflict led to the capture of Havana and Manila, though both were returned at the peace in exchange for Florida. The British realm now stretched across multiple continents, encompassing diverse populations and requiring new approaches to governance. Victory brought unprecedented power but also new challenges of administration and finance. War debts significantly shaped policy in the conflict's aftermath. The national debt nearly doubled to £132 million, requiring increased taxation and fiscal restraint. Parliamentary attention turned toward making overseas possessions more profitable and forcing them to bear a larger share of defense costs. The Proclamation of 1763 temporarily prohibited settlement beyond the Appalachian Mountains, aiming to reduce expensive frontier conflicts with indigenous nations. This restriction frustrated land speculators and settlers with Western ambitions, creating tensions with American elites. Administrative reforms attempted to rationalize governance. The establishment of a Board of Trade and a new American department reflected the growing complexity of managing distant territories. In India, parliamentary investigation into company corruption led to limited reforms, though significant changes awaited the governance failures of later decades. Part 25. new officials arrived in America, charged with enforcing trade regulations that had previously been only loosely implemented, thereby creating significant friction with merchants accustomed to operating with minimal oversight. The Atlantic territories now encompassed millions of non-English peoples, necessitating new strategies of control. The Quebec Act accommodated French-Canadian linguistic and religious practices. A pragmatic approach to governing the approximately 70,000 French settlers now under Crown rule. In Florida, similar accommodations extended to Spanish Catholics. These measures reflected an emerging recognition that direct cultural assimilation might be impractical for governing diverse populations. Though they prompted concerns among Protestant Americans about religious tolerance toward Catholicism, indigenous nations confronted vastly changed circumstances after French removal. The Ottawa leader Pontiac led a powerful pan-tribal resistance movement, capturing most western forts and threatening frontier settlements, though eventually defeated. This uprising significantly influenced the Proclamation Line decision and demonstrated continuing indigenous power, without the option of playing European powers against each other. Native American nations developed new strategies of resistance and accommodation. Though their bargaining position had fundamentally weakened, new British taxes provoked American resistance. The Sugar Act imposed duties on molasses while establishing vice-admiralty courts to prosecute smugglers without local juries, thereby bypassing colonial legal systems. The Stamp Act required tax stamps on legal documents, newspapers, and other paper items, directly affecting professionals and publishers who organized effective resistance through boycotts and intimidation of stamp distributors. The Declaratory Act, accompanying the Stamp Act's repeal, asserted parliamentary authority to legislate for all territories in all cases whatsoever, a sweeping claim Americans increasingly rejected. Part 26. The growing crisis revealed fundamentally different conceptions of governance. Parliamentary supremacy, widely accepted at home as the foundation of constitutional order after the Glorious Revolution, conflicted sharply with American understandings that emphasized local assemblies' traditional rights to approve taxation. Resistance increasingly employed the powerful language of English liberties and constitutional principles, claiming the rights of freeborn subjects, rather than rejecting connection entirely. This constitutional crisis reflected the profound failure to develop coherent principles for incorporating distant territories within a unified imperial framework. The Townshend duties imposed indirect taxes on imported glass, paint, paper, and tea, prompting renewed boycotts throughout the colonies. The stationing of troops in Boston led to growing tensions, culminating in the Boston Massacre when soldiers fired on a crowd, killing 5 civilians. Though Parliament repealed most Townshend duties, the tea tax remained as a symbolic assertion of authority. A constant irritant. The Boston Tea Party, the destruction of East India Company tea by protesters disguised as Native Americans, triggered punitive measures known as the Coercive Acts, or, in America, the Intolerable Acts. The Quebec Act, passed alongside these measures, extended Quebec's boundaries to include the Ohio Valley while recognizing Catholic rights and French civil law. Though unrelated to the developing crisis with the 13 mainland territories, its timing and provisions inflamed American opinion. Protestant settlers viewed the Catholic accommodations as evidence of royal antipathy toward traditional liberties, while land speculators objected to the Ohio Valley's placement under Quebec jurisdiction. These measures intensified cooperation through the Continental Congress. The British administration failed to appreciate how American societies had evolved. Mainland settlements contained over 2 million European inhabitants with distinct regional identities and increasing economic self-sufficiency. Part 27. Local elites, educated in Enlightenment principles and experienced in self-government through regional assemblies, fundamentally rejected the notion that Parliament could arbitrarily impose policies without their consent. Distance had created divergent political cultures that authorities in London inadequately understood. Commercial interests further complicated the emerging conflict. American commerce remained largely oriented toward metropolitan markets, while local elites maintained robust business connections and cultural affinities with the homeland. Many prominent figures initially sought reconciliation rather than outright independence. Economic boycotts were specifically designed to pressure Parliament through metropolitan merchants who suffered significantly from interrupted trade. Only after failed petitions and escalating military confrontation did independence finally emerge as the dominant position among American leaders. Even as transatlantic relations deteriorated, British expansion continued on other frontiers. Captain James Cook's Pacific voyages meticulously mapped vast oceanic regions while claiming Australia for the crown. The East India Company consolidated control in Bengal, while simultaneously expanding influence in other Indian regions. These simultaneous developments demonstrated how British imperial operations continued across multiple frontiers concurrently, with crises in one region often occurring alongside expansion in others. Caribbean and Canadian territories remained loyal during the American conflict, highlighting regional diversity within the empire. West Indian planters, heavily dependent on naval protection and metropolitan markets, saw little advantage in independence despite sharing many grievances with mainland Americans about trade restrictions. French Canadians, only recently brought under Crown rule, remained neutral or loyal rather than joining their former enemies, the American colonists. These variations revealed how economic structures, cultural differences, and strategic considerations produced different responses to British policy throughout its vast territories. The revolution that began at Lexington and Concord represented not just a rebellion but a profound constitutional crisis for the entire British overseas system. Part 28. The Declaration of Independence articulated a devastating critique of monarchical government, while establishing enduring principles of consent and natural rights that would profoundly influence in subsequent independence movements elsewhere in the world. Though framed as a response to specific grievances, the revolution raised fundamental questions about the legitimacy of distant rule that would resurface repeatedly in later history. By 1776, the British realm stood at a pivotal crossroads. Military forces fought desperately to retain the 13 mainland territories while simultaneously administering vastly expanded lands stretching from the Mississippi River to Bengal in India. The mercantile system that had structured British trade for a century faced its first major challenge. Governance practices developed for smaller, more homogeneous possessions struggled immensely to adapt to the administration of millions of French, Spanish, indigenous, and Indian subjects. The American crisis vividly revealed inherent tensions in governing distant territories through representative institutions, tensions that would require entirely new approaches in the century ahead. When 56 delegates to the Continental Congress signed the Declaration of Independence, few observers, either within Britain or abroad, expected their rebellion to succeed. The British monarchy commanded the world's strongest navy, professional armies, considerable financial resources, and a global network of territories and allies. The rebellious American territories, though populous by New World standards with around 2.5 million inhabitants, possessed no regular army, no navy, minimal manufacturing capacity, and limited diplomatic connections. Yet, within 7 short years, these seemingly mismatched antagonists would sign a peace treaty recognizing American independence, fundamentally altering the trajectory of global history. This extraordinary outcome resulted from a complex interplay of factors. The struggle represented both a conventional military contest and an unprecedented political challenge to established imperial norms. Part 29. Fighting a War 3,000 miles from home created immense logistical difficulties that even the most powerful European nations struggled to overcome. The vast North American landscape, with its sprawling geography, dense forests, and scattered settlements, inherently favored defensive operations and guerrilla tactics over traditional European battlefield approaches. Geography largely dictated strategy. The Crown's forces needed to control key ports and waterways, particularly the Hudson River corridor, which could effectively isolate New England from other rebellious regions. After driving Continental forces from New York in 1776, General William Howe pursued a conservative strategy aimed at occupying major population centers rather than destroying Washington's army. This approach, while securing Philadelphia in 1777, failed to deliver a decisive victory despite tactical successes in numerous engagements. George Washington, commanding the Continental Army, shrewdly recognized his forces' limitations. He adopted a Fabian strategy, consistently avoiding decisive battles while keeping his army intact, thereby gradually wearing down enemy resolve through persistence rather than dramatic victories. Though defeated at Long Island, Brandywine, and Germantown, his forces achieved crucial successes at Trenton and Princeton that significantly boosted flagging morale and powerfully demonstrated the rebellion's resilience. The American commander succeeded simply by not losing, by maintaining a functional fighting force despite repeated setbacks. The 1777 campaign marked a crucial turning point in the war. General John Burgoyne led an ambitious expedition from Canada southward, intending to isolate New England from other rebellious territories. His force of regular troops, German mercenaries, loyalists, and indigenous allies initially captured Fort Ticonderoga, but soon encountered mounting difficulties. Slowed by difficult terrain and constantly harassed by militia, Burgoyne's increasingly isolated army found itself surrounded at Saratoga. His surrender of nearly 6,000 troops in October delivered not just a significant military victory but a diplomatic breakthrough, finally convincing France to formally ally with the rebellious Americans. Part 30. France's entry transformed the conflict from a mere domestic rebellion into a full-scale international war. The world's second naval power now directly challenged British forces across multiple theaters while simultaneously providing Washington's army with essential military supplies, professional officers, and eventually, direct military support. Spain subsequently joined as a French ally, forcing London to defend distant territories from the Mediterranean to the Caribbean. This expanded conflict diluted British military resources and significantly complicated strategic planning, as policymakers had to constantly balance European priorities against American operations. Financial factors increasingly influenced the war's course. While Parliament could borrow enormous sums, the conflict's immense costs strained even the sophisticated London financial markets. American forces faced even greater fiscal challenges. The Continental Congress lacked taxation power and relied heavily on printing increasingly worthless paper currency. The phrase, "not worth a continental," became a byword for something valueless as hyperinflation ravaged the American economy. The French alliance provided crucial financial support, though at the cost of massive debt that would later contribute significantly to France's own revolution. The Southern theater gained prominence in the conflict's later stages. After the Franco-American alliance, strategists in London shifted focus toward the Carolinas and Virginia, where Loyalist sentiment seemed stronger. Despite victories at Savannah and Charleston, these operations failed to durably restore British authority. Local militia forces under leaders like Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, effectively employed guerrilla tactics against conventional British troops, while Nathaniel Greene's Continental Army units used mobility and local knowledge to their strategic advantage. The conflict's global dimensions expanded further when the Dutch Republic entered as an American ally, and Catherine the Great of Russia organized neutral nations into the League of Armed Neutrality, directly challenging the Royal Navy's maritime practices. Part 31. Meanwhile, the Anglo-French rivalry spread to India, where the East India Company and French forces renewed their struggle for influence among local powers. The Caribbean saw intensive naval combat as both sides sought to capture or defend valuable sugar islands. This worldwide confrontation stretched British military resources thin, forcing difficult strategic choices between widely dispersed theaters. On North American battlefields, the war took on characteristics that distinguished it from traditional European conflicts. While set-piece battles occurred periodically, much of the fighting involved small unit actions, ambushes, raids, and skirmishes. Militia forces on both sides effectively employed intimate knowledge of local terrain. Indigenous nations aligned strategically with either side based on careful calculations of their own interests and survival. The conflict often blurred distinctions between combatants and civilians, with communities dividing deeply between loyalist and revolutionary sympathies, sometimes resulting in brutal neighbor-against-neighbor violence. These internal divisions revealed how the conflict simultaneously constituted both a revolution and a civil war. Approximately one-fifth of the population remained loyal to the crown, while another substantial portion attempted to remain neutral. Some 19,000 Americans served in loyalist military units, while perhaps 100,000 loyalist refugees eventually evacuated to Canada, the Caribbean, or back across the Atlantic. These internal fractures created enduring bitterness, with victorious revolutionaries confiscating loyalist property and sometimes perpetrating violent reprisals against their countrymen. The war's decisive campaign came at Yorktown in 1781. After years of inconclusive engagements, a rare convergence of favorable circumstances presented Washington with a unique opportunity. The French West Indies fleet under Admiral de Grasse temporarily achieved naval superiority along the Virginia coast, while the Comte de Rochambeau's French army joined Continental forces in a rapid southward march. Lord Cornwallis, commanding British forces in Virginia, found himself trapped on the Yorktown Peninsula without naval support. His surrender on October 19 effectively ended major combat operations, though formal peace remained distant. Part 32. Peace negotiations commenced in Paris, with American diplomats John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and John Jay securing remarkably favorable terms despite their nascent nation's precarious position. The agreement recognized American independence, established generous boundaries extending to the Mississippi River, and granted fishing rights off Newfoundland. Most significantly, the American negotiators skillfully extracted themselves from their French alliance obligations by concluding a separate peace. The Treaty of Paris, signed in September 1783, formally ended the conflict, though frontier violence continued in areas where indigenous nations rejected the peace terms. For the departing European power, the American defeat necessitated profound strategic recalibration. The loss of 13 mainland territories removed approximately half the North American population from British Crown control. Traditional mercantilist assumptions about colonial relationships required fundamental rethinking. Trade patterns disrupted by 8 years of conflict needed rebuilding on new foundations. The fiscal burden of war debts demanded administrative reforms and tax increases. Most fundamentally, confidence in the existing model of oceanic governance suffered a severe blow, prompting soul-searching about how to maintain control over remaining overseas possessions. Yet, the outcome, while unquestionably a setback, produced more nuanced consequences than outright catastrophe. Trade with the newly independent United States actually increased in the years following independence as commercial relationships resumed without restrictive mercantilist policies. British forces retained Canada, the Caribbean Sugar Islands, and strategic positions around Hudson Bay and Newfoundland. The Royal Navy maintained its maritime supremacy despite French and Spanish challenges. Most significantly, the East India Company continued expanding its jurisdiction in South Asia, laying foundations for future wealth and influence that would eventually dwarf what had been lost in North America. American independence accelerated the transformation of the British imperial project from a primarily Atlantic-focused enterprise to a more globally distributed network. Part 33. The East India Company, already governing millions in Bengal, gained enhanced parliamentary attention as the most valuable remaining overseas asset. The loss of American timber supplies prompted intensified interest in the forestry resources of New Zealand and Australia. Caribbean sugar possessions received renewed strategic priority, with naval stations strengthened against French and Spanish threats. These reorientations, while partially reactive, powerfully demonstrated the adaptability that characterized the broader British project of overseas governance. The ideological impact reverberated far beyond immediate strategic concerns. The Republican experiment launched in the former American territories challenged fundamental assumptions about monarchy, aristocracy, and political legitimacy. The language of natural rights, powerfully articulated in the Declaration of Independence, offered a revolutionary vocabulary that would inspire subsequent liberation movements worldwide. The American example demonstrated that peripheral territories could successfully assert independence against the European center, establishing a crucial precedent that other subjugated peoples would eventually invoke. This ideological challenge prompted constitutional innovation within the remaining North American territories. The Quebec Act had already established a precedent for accommodating non-Protestant, non-English-speaking populations. After the arrival of thousands of Loyalist refugees, the Constitutional Act of 1791 divided the province of Quebec into Upper Canada, predominantly English-speaking, and Lower Canada, primarily French-speaking, each with representative institutions. These reforms aimed to provide local self-government, while maintaining ultimate metropolitan authority. An attempt to address the grievances that had fueled American discontent, while preserving central control. The American Revolution revealed profound tensions in Enlightenment political thought that would resurface throughout subsequent anti-colonial movements. American revolutionaries effectively employed the language of liberty to justify independence while simultaneously maintaining slavery and continuing to dispossess indigenous peoples. Part 34. This contradiction between liberatory rhetoric and continued practices of exclusion and subjugation characterized many later independence movements throughout the world. The revolutionary principle that government required the consent of the governed posed fundamental challenges to the entire concept of ruling distant territories without meaningful representation. For those who remained enslaved in the new American Republic, the Revolution delivered mixed consequences. Northern states gradually implemented emancipation, while southern plantations intensified their dependence on forced labor. Many enslaved people had sought freedom by joining British Crown forces, which promised liberation in exchange for military service. Approximately 20,000 escaped behind royal lines during the conflict, with some evacuating to Nova Scotia, the Caribbean, or Sierra Leone when Crown forces withdrew. This pattern of imperial revolutionary conflicts creating opportunities for enslaved people to seek freedom through strategic alignment would recur during subsequent liberation struggles. Indigenous nations confronted dramatically changed circumstances after American independence. The Treaty of Paris largely ignored their sovereignty, effectively ceding their territories to the new republic without consultation. British Crown officials in Canada maintained alliances with northern nations, creating a buffer against American expansion while securing military partners for potential future conflicts. Southern nations, however, faced unrestrained pressure from American settlers crossing the Appalachian Mountains. The mixed outcomes for indigenous peoples highlighted how European imperial rivalries sometimes created space for native autonomy that disappeared when those rivalries resolved. The Loyalist diaspora transformed numerous communities throughout the remaining North American territories. Approximately 30,000 refugees settled in Canada, including free black Loyalists who established communities in Nova Scotia. Others relocated to the Bahamas, profoundly transforming the island's demographics and economy. Some returned to the British Isles, while particularly elite Loyalists received compensation for lost American properties. Part 35. This scattered exile community maintained strong transatlantic connections and often contributed significantly to the governance and development of the regions where they resettled. In the Caribbean, the American conflict severely disrupted established trade patterns. Islands previously dependent on North American timber, fish, and grain faced acute supply challenges when wartime conditions interrupted these vital connections. After American independence, The new United States lost preferential access to West Indian markets under the Navigation Acts. These disruptions accelerated interest in developing alternative supply sources within remaining British possessions, particularly Canada, while also encouraging Caribbean planters to reserve more land for local food production despite its opportunity cost compared to lucrative sugar cultivation. The intellectual reaction against revolution profoundly influenced administrative approaches for decades. Edmund Burke, while sympathetic to American grievances, recoiled sharply from the radical implications of French revolutionary thought. His eloquent advocacy for gradual, organic political development rather than abstract, rights-based reforms deeply influenced a generation of British administrators. The cautionary example of the American Revolution prompted greater attention to addressing grievances before they escalated into independence movements, though not necessarily a greater willingness to devolve meaningful power to local populations. The post-revolution era saw administrative reforms specifically aimed at more effective centralized control. The India Act of 1784 established a board of control overseeing the East India Company, thereby asserting parliamentary authority over what had previously operated as virtually a private government. William Pitt's government created new administrative structures that sought to balance commercial interests with strategic and humanitarian concerns. These reforms reflected a recognition that effective overseas governance required more systematic metropolitan oversight. Yet they still operated primarily through privileged corporations rather than direct state control. Ph. 36. Naval lessons gleaned from the American conflict profoundly shaped subsequent British maritime strategy. The French fleet's crucial role at Yorktown demonstrated the severe vulnerability of overseas operations without clear naval superiority. In response, the Admiralty accelerated ambitious shipbuilding programs and developed more extensive networks of naval bases to support global operations. The successful Franco-Spanish siege of Gibraltar, though ultimately lifted, starkly highlighted the critical importance of overseas strongpoints for projecting power. These experiences heavily informed planning for the coming conflicts with revolutionary and Napoleonic France, placing greater emphasis on maintaining unchallenged naval supremacy regardless of cost. For the newly independent United States, victory brought its own set of formidable challenges. The weak central government established under the Articles of Confederation struggled immensely with the war's financial legacy and intense interstate rivalries. The 1787 Constitutional Convention subsequently created a more robust federal structure, though debates about centralization versus state authority continued to animate American politics. Diplomatically, the new nation navigated complex challenges, including continued British occupation of northwestern forts, restricted access to lucrative Caribbean markets, and intricate relationships with European powers. Despite formal independence, the American Republic remained economically and culturally intertwined with its former ruler. By 1783, both nations embarked on new, distinct trajectories. The former colonies began their republican experiment, expanding westward into indigenous territories while debating the profound tensions between liberty and slavery that would eventually lead to their devastating civil war. The United Kingdom, though diminished in North America, accelerated administrative reforms that would enable unprecedented global expansion in the coming century. Their separation, though rooted in bitter conflict, established enduring patterns of cultural, linguistic, legal, and commercial connection that would eventually evolve into what later observers termed a special relationship, one that would profoundly shape world history long after memories of revolution faded. Part 37. In the immediate aftermath of American independence, British attention increasingly turned eastward. While the loss of 13 rebellious territories marked a significant setback in the Atlantic world, the East India Company was simultaneously transforming from a mere trading enterprise into a formidable governing power across the Indian subcontinent. This remarkable shift, commercial agents becoming de facto territorial rulers, occurred through a complex combination of opportunity, necessity, an ambition rather than through any coherent metropolitan design or grand strategy. The company's direct territorial control began with Robert Clive's pivotal victory at Plassey in 1757, which effectively secured the wealthy province of Bengal. Initially, company agents maintained the legal fiction of ruling on behalf of the Mughal emperor, collecting revenue through the Diwani, tax collection rights, while local nawabs handled day-to-day administration. This arrangement allowed for enormous private profiteering by company officials, who exploited their positions to amass spectacular personal fortunes. Tales of these nabobs, returning home to Britain with immense wealth, both fascinated and scandalized the London public. Warren Hastings, appointed as the first Governor-General of Bengal in 1772, attempted to systematize this haphazard governance. His administration established new revenue collection systems, formalized judicial structures, and initiated diplomatic relations with neighboring Indian states. Hastings demonstrated genuine interest in Indian cultures and knowledge, actively supporting translations of Sanskrit texts and establishing the Asiatic Society of Bengal. Yet his tenure remained highly controversial, culminating in a lengthy impeachment trial in Parliament, though he was ultimately acquitted. The India Act of 1784 marked a pivotal shift in governance, responding to widespread criticisms of company misrule. Parliament established a board of control with broad authority over the company's political functions while leaving its commercial operations relatively independent. This created a hybrid system, neither fully private nor entirely governmental, that would characterize the administration of the subcontinent for decades. The act represented an early recognition that commercial priorities alone could not effectively guide the governance of millions of people. Part 38. Lord Cornwallis, appointed Governor-General in 1786 after his surrender at Yorktown in the American Revolution, implemented significant administrative reforms in India. His permanent settlement of 1793 fixed land revenue rates in Bengal, thereby creating a new class of zamindars, or landlords, with hereditary rights. This decision, intended to establish stable revenue streams for the company, profoundly transformed rural social structures and property relationships for generations. Cornwallis also formalized the growing separation between European officials and Indian subjects, explicitly excluding the latter from senior positions in an increasingly racialized administration. Military expansion accelerated under the governorship of Richard Wellesley from 1798 to 1805. His subsidiary alliance system forced Indian states to accept company troops, pay for their maintenance, and surrender foreign policy control, while nominally maintaining internal autonomy. These arrangements effectively extended British influence without requiring direct rule, creating a constellation of princely states orbiting around company territories. Hyderabad, Mysore, Awadh, and other significant states entered these unequal relationships, acknowledging company paramountcy while retaining a symbolic degree of independence. The defeat of Tipu Sultan at Seringapatam in 1799 eliminated a significant obstacle to British expansion. As ruler of Mysore, Tipu had allied with France and effectively employed European military innovations within an Indian context. His death during the final battle removed one of the few Indian rulers who effectively challenged company dominance. This victory vividly displayed the growing military advantage of company forces, which combined European techniques with Indian troops, sepoys, in a hybrid fighting force that proved remarkably effective throughout the subcontinent. Territorial holdings expanded dramatically through both conquest and annexation. The Marathas, a powerful confederacy of warrior states that dominated central India, presented the final major indigenous resistance to British power. A series of Anglo-Maratha wars culminated in their defeat by 1818, removing the last significant military challenger on the subcontinent. Part 39. Governor-General Dalhousie later implemented a controversial doctrine of lapse, annexing princely states when rulers died without natural heirs. This policy, viewed as illegitimate by many Indians, brought territories like Satara, Jiangxi, and eventually Awadh under direct company rule. Beyond the subcontinent, the company extended its reach across Asia. Singapore's founding in 1819 by Stamford Raffles created a strategic foothold in Southeast Asia. The First Anglo-Burmese War annexed coastal territories that later formed part of Burma, Myanmar. The First Opium War with China secured Hong Kong and forced Beijing to open treaty ports to foreign commerce. These expansions reflected both strategic considerations and commercial ambitions, effectively extending British influence across Asia and securing vital trade routes from the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. The commercial foundations of this expansion lay primarily in agricultural commodities. Cotton from Gujarat and the Deccan, indigo from Bengal, opium from Bihar, and tea from Assam flowed through company networks to markets worldwide. Simultaneously, textiles manufactured in the industrial centers of northern England increasingly flooded Indian markets, devastating local handloom industries that had previously been world-renowned. This reversal, India transformed from an exporter to an importer of textiles, exemplified the profound economic transformation wrought by industrialization and imperial trade patterns. Opium represented a particularly problematic but immensely profitable commodity. Grown under company monopoly in India, it was transported to China to address a persistent trade imbalance caused by European demand for Chinese tea, silks, and porcelain. When Chinese authorities attempted to halt this destructive narcotics trade, the resulting conflict, justified under the rhetoric of free trade, forced China to accept the commerce despite its devastating social consequences. This episode starkly illustrated how commercial interests frequently trumped ethical considerations in the expanding Eastern trade networks. Part 40. Meanwhile, administrative policies increasingly reflected utilitarian and evangelical influences from metropolitan intellectual currents. The Charter Act of 1813 allowed missionaries to operate freely in company territories, ending earlier restrictions based on fears of religious provocation. Educational initiatives emphasized English language instruction, with Thomas Babington Macaulay famously aiming to create a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in tastes, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. These cultural interventions reflected growing confidence in the superiority of European models and diminishing respect for indigenous traditions. Infrastructure development accelerated to facilitate administration and commerce. The Grand Trunk Road was expanded and improved for military movement and commercial traffic. Irrigation canals increased agricultural productivity while transforming traditional water management systems. Experiments with steam navigation on major rivers enhanced mobility and communication. The last years of company rule saw initial railway construction, beginning a transportation revolution that would eventually create the fourth largest rail network worldwide. These projects primarily served strategic and commercial purposes while simultaneously generating lucrative contracts for metropolitan firms. Urbanization accompanied administrative expansion, with the presidency towns of Kolkata, Bombay, and Madras developing as major centers of European settlement and commercial activity. These cities displayed stark social divisions, with European sections featuring neoclassical architecture, planned streets, and exclusive social spaces, while adjacent Indian neighborhoods maintained different spatial organizations and cultural practices. Urban institutions like universities, museums, and botanical gardens served both practical administrative purposes and symbolic demonstrations of European knowledge systems. Scientific endeavors flourished amid this administrative expansion. The Great Trigonometrical Survey meticulously mapped the subcontinent with unprecedented precision, facilitating both military operations and revenue collection. Botanical investigations catalogued plant species with keen attention to their commercial and medicinal potential. William Jones and other Orientalist scholars documented Indian languages, literature, and history, though often interpreting findings through European frameworks that distorted indigenous knowledge systems. These scientific projects simultaneously advanced knowledge and served imperial interests. Part 41. The East India Company workforce evolved significantly over this period. Early administrations featured numerous mixed-race families and considerable cultural hybridity, with many officials adopting Indian customs, languages, and sometimes even religions. However, racial attitudes hardened noticeably over time, particularly after 1800. Increasing numbers of European women arrived, reducing intermarriage. Housing segregation became more pronounced. The evangelical movement encouraged cultural distance rather than accommodation. By mid-century, the administration displayed more rigid racial hierarchies and less cultural integration than earlier company operations. Alternative centers of power developed alongside company expansion. Kolkata emerged as the administrative capital, with Government House symbolizing British authority. 4,000 miles away, Leadenhall Street in London housed East India House, where the company's court of directors made policy. Parliamentary oversight from Westminster added another layer of authority. This dispersed governance, with power centers spanning continents, created communication challenges and accountability problems that contributed to administrative dysfunction and opportunities for abuse. The legal system exemplified this hybrid governance. Company courts administered different rules for different populations, English common law for Europeans, while Hindu and Muslim personal laws governed family matters for their respective communities. Criminal procedures increasingly followed European models but maintained distinctions based on religious and ethnic identity. This plural legal structure acknowledged cultural differences while establishing overarching British authority, creating a distinctive administrative approach later replicated in other colonial contexts. Resistance to company authority took multiple forms. Dispossessed rulers occasionally mounted military challenges, though with diminishing success over time. Religious leaders sometimes organized opposition, as in the Vellore Mutiny of 1806. Peasant uprisings responded to excessive taxation or agricultural disruption. Urban protests contested specific policies. These varied resistance movements, though typically localized and uncoordinated, demonstrated that company rule never achieved uncontested acceptance despite its military advantages. The company simultaneously expanded into new regions beyond the subcontinent. Australia, claimed by Captain James Cook in 1770, received its first convict fleet in 1788. Establishing a penal colony at Sydney Cove that gradually developed into a settler society. Part 42. New Zealand's colonization proceeded more slowly, with the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840 establishing formal relations with Maori tribes. These Pacific territories, initially administered with minimal investment, would later become significant population centers for European settlement with very different trajectories from the densely populated Asian possessions. The abolition movement heightened humanitarian scrutiny of company operations. After decades of campaigning by religious groups and reformers, Parliament abolished the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself throughout the realm in 1833. These moral victories emboldened reformers to address other perceived abuses in overseas territories. The company increasingly faced criticism from humanitarian advocates, evangelical Christians, and utilitarian reformers concerned about the treatment of indigenous populations. This metropolitan scrutiny influenced administrative approaches and sometimes constrained the company's autonomy. Intellectual justifications for British rule evolved during this period. Early pragmatic explanations based on commercial advantage gradually gave way to more elaborate civilizational narratives, as Victorian sensibilities emerged. The civilizing mission concept gained prominence, framing British governance as beneficial guidance for supposedly less developed societies. James Mill's influential History of British India, despite the author never visiting the subcontinent, characterized Indian civilization as stagnant and backward, requiring European intervention for progress. These narratives conveniently align moral purpose with commercial advantage. The Indian Rebellion of 1857 to 1858 marked the decisive end of company rule. Beginning with sepoy resistance to cartridges greased with animal fat, offensive to both Hindu and Muslim religious practices, the uprising spread rapidly through north-central India. Rebels temporarily restored the elderly Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar as nominal sovereign. The rebellion featured exceptional violence on both sides, with massacres of European civilians at Kanpur followed by brutal reprisals. The uprising's suppression involved widespread destruction and collective punishment that left lasting scars on community relations. Part 43. The rebellion's causes extended far beyond the immediate cartridge controversy. Annexation policies had generated widespread insecurity among traditional elites. Religious communities feared cultural interference from evangelical influences. Peasants suffered under heavy taxation. Displaced rulers and soldiers harbored deep resentments. Urban populations experienced severe economic disruption. These varied grievances coalesced into a significant challenge to company authority. Though the rebellion remained geographically limited and never spread throughout the entire subcontinent, Parliament responded by transferring India directly to Crown control through the Government of India Act of 1858. The company, after more than 250 years of existence, was formally abolished. Queen Victoria became Empress of India, governing through a Secretary of State and a Viceroy. This transition marked a formal acknowledgement that governing millions required direct governmental oversight rather than corporate management. The proclamation accompanying this transition promised non-interference in religious matters and respect for princely rights, attempting to address key grievances that had fueled the rebellion. By 1858, the nature of British overseas governance had fundamentally transformed from its commercial origins. What began as mere trading posts operated by merchant adventurers had become an elaborate administrative apparatus governing millions across multiple continents. This evolution from trade to sovereignty occurred through innumerable individual decisions rather than any grand design. The East India Company's remarkable history exemplified how commercial ventures unexpectedly generated governing responsibilities, creating new forms of cross-cultural interaction, economic transformation, and political subjugation that would characterize the Victorian era ahead. The decades following the Indian Rebellion witnessed unprecedented global expansion. Queen Victoria's proclamation as Empress of India in 1877 symbolized a new imperial confidence after earlier crises. By the time the monarch celebrated her Diamond Jubilee in 1897, the realm under her sovereignty encompassed nearly 1/4 of the world's land surface and population. This Victorian era marked both the territorial apex and the cultural flourishing of a global project. Part 44. The empire stretched from the Canadian Arctic to New Zealand, from Caribbean islands to African savannas, and from Mediterranean fortresses to Pacific atolls. New technologies dramatically enhanced the capacity for global control. Steamships significantly reduced journey times and increased reliability compared to sailing vessels. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869, shortened the route to Asia by thousands of miles. Railways penetrated continental interiors previously accessible only by arduous overland journeys. Telegraph cables, including Brunel's remarkable transatlantic line, enabled near-instantaneous communication across vast distances. These innovations effectively compressed space and time, making it possible to administer far-flung territories with unprecedented coordination and responsiveness. India transformed under direct crown rule. The new Raj maintained many company administrative structures but expanded central authority and European oversight. Viceroys like Lord Curzon implemented ambitious programs of public works, educational reform, and administrative reorganization. Railway construction accelerated dramatically, eventually creating a network of over 40,000 miles that unified the subcontinent economically while facilitating military deployment and famine relief. The Indian civil service, selected through rigorous competitive examinations, developed into a prestigious administrative elite that prided itself on incorruptibility and efficiency. The scramble for Africa represented the most dramatic territorial expansion of this era. Before 1880, permanent European presence in Africa remained limited primarily to coastal enclaves and the Cape Colony. Within 2 decades, European powers had divided nearly the entire continent among themselves. The 1884 to 1885 Berlin Conference established rules for this partition, requiring effective occupation rather than mere coastal claims to justify territorial control. This diplomatic framework accelerated the military conquest of African societies regardless of their existing political structures or boundaries. Cecil Rhodes exemplified the ambitious individuals who drove African expansion. Arriving in South Africa at age 17, Rhodes amassed enormous wealth through diamond mining before entering politics. Part 45. As Prime Minister of Cape Colony, Cecil Rhodes extended British authority northward, with the territory eventually bearing his name as Rhodesia. His vision of a Cape to Cairo corridor, representing a continuous band of red, British territory on the map, characterized the grandiose territorial ambitions of this era. Rhodes skillfully combined commercial opportunism, strategic thinking, and racial ideologies into a potent justification for expansion that garnered significant metropolitan support despite considerable costs. Local populations across Africa fiercely resisted incorporation through various strategies. The Ashanti Zulu and other kingdoms mounted significant military challenges before ultimately succumbing to superior European firepower. The Mahdiist movement in Sudan combined religious revival with armed resistance, initially defeating Egyptian forces before falling to Kitchener's campaign. Ethiopia uniquely maintained its independence by decisively defeating Italian forces at Adwa in 1896. Elsewhere, communities employed passive resistance, strategic accommodation, or flight to remote regions to preserve their autonomy. These varied responses powerfully demonstrated that African societies were never passive recipients of external control. Military technology increasingly tilted power balances away from indigenous forces. The Maxim gun, an early machine gun capable of firing 600 rounds per minute, provided devastating firepower against conventionally armed opponents. Artillery, rifles, and other European weapons widened military disparities. Royal Navy gunboats extended British power along major rivers, bombarding riverside communities into submission. These technological advantages, rather than inherent organizational superiority, frequently determined conflict outcomes, allowing relatively small European forces to defeat numerically superior opponents. Administrative systems varied considerably across African territories. In West Africa, indirect rule worked through existing chiefs and traditional authorities, leveraging local structures. In settler regions like Kenya and Rhodesia, European minorities claimed prime agricultural lands while relegating indigenous populations to reserves. Part 46. In South Africa, mineral wealth motivated increasingly formal racial segregation to control labor. These diverse administrative approaches shared a common structure of ultimate European authority, exercised through various combinations of local collaboration, segregation, economic pressure, and periodic force. Colonial economies restructured African production around exported raw materials and imported manufactured goods. Gold and diamonds from South Africa, cotton from Egypt and Uganda, coffee from Kenya, rubber from tropical regions, and palm oil from West Africa flowed predominantly toward European markets and industries. Transportation infrastructure, railways, ports, telegraphs, developed primarily to facilitate this extraction rather than internal development within Africa. These economic patterns created dependencies that would persist long after political independence, establishing structural inequalities with lasting consequences. Economic transformation extended beyond formal territories through informal empire, regions where financial and commercial influence secured metropolitan interests without direct administration. Argentina, though politically independent, relied heavily on London finance and trade relationships. Ottoman territories witnessed European financial advisors controlling revenue systems to service debts. China granted concessions and treaty ports under duress. These arrangements demonstrated how economic leverage often proved more cost-effective than formal annexation while still securing key commercial and strategic interests. The Suez Canal represented both strategic and symbolic importance in this system. Opened in 1869 under French engineering leadership. Financial difficulties soon allowed London to acquire a controlling interest when Prime Minister Disraeli purchased the Egyptian Cadiz shares. The canal shortened the route to India by approximately 4,000 miles, dramatically reducing journey times and shipping costs. Its strategic significance motivated the occupation of Egypt in 1882. Ostensibly temporary, but lasting until 1956. This vital waterway became the central artery of global commerce and naval mobility. Part 47. Competition with other European powers intensified dramatically during this period. France, recovering from earlier defeats, established a significant African empire and maintained strong footholds in Asia. Germany, unified in 1871, vociferously demanded a place in the sun through territories in Africa and the Pacific. Russia continued its relentless expansion in Central Asia, approaching India's northwestern frontier, raising British anxieties. Belgium's King Leopold claimed the vast Congo as a personal possession, leading to horrific exploitation. Italy sought compensation for its late national unification through African acquisitions. These rival ambitions created a complex and often tense diplomatic environment, requiring constant negotiation and occasional compromise. The Great Game, with Russia, exemplified these strategic rivalries. Russian expansion into Central Asia triggered anxiety about potential threats to India's northwestern frontier. This perceived vulnerability motivated forward policies, including the disastrous First Afghan War, border adjustments, the creation of buffer states, and extensive intelligence operations. Rudyard Kipling's novel Kim popularized this shadowy contest of espionage and influence. Though direct military confrontation never materialized, this rivalry profoundly shaped regional boundaries, military planning, and diplomatic alignments throughout the period. China presented both immense opportunity and significant challenge. The Second Opium War forced further concessions, opening additional treaty ports to European commerce. The unequal treaties system granted extraterritorial rights, preventing Chinese courts from exercising jurisdiction over European nationals. Hong Kong developed as a crown colony and a major commercial hub. However, the Taiping Rebellion, Boxer Uprising, and other internal crises powerfully demonstrated Chinese society's deep-seated resistance to external pressure and intrusion. These tensions between commercial penetration and nationalist resistance foreshadowed later decolonization struggles elsewhere. Ideological justifications for expansion evolved significantly during this period. Earlier commercial explanations gave way to more elaborate civilizational, racial, and religious narratives. Part 48. The civilizing mission concept gained immense prominence through figures like David Livingstone, who skillfully combined missionary work with extensive exploration. Social Darwinist interpretations portrayed European control over lesser races as natural and inevitable. Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, powerfully captured this perceived obligation to govern supposedly less developed peoples, conveniently aligning moral purpose with strategic and commercial advantage. Science and knowledge production became increasingly intertwined with imperial projects. The Royal Geographical Society sponsored explorations that combined scientific inquiry with strategic intelligence gathering. Botanical gardens collected and classified plants with keen attention to their commercial potential. Anthropologists documented indigenous cultures while often reinforcing racial hierarchies and notions of European superiority. Medical researchers diligently studied tropical diseases whose control was essential for European survival in unfamiliar environments. These knowledge systems simultaneously advanced scientific understanding and facilitated administrative control. Cultural engineering represented a significant aspect of governance. Educational systems emphasized European languages, literature, and history, thereby creating Western-oriented elites in colonized societies. Legal systems imposed European concepts of property and contract, fundamentally transforming traditional relationships to land and community. Christian missionaries challenged indigenous religious practices while establishing schools and hospitals that extended European cultural influence. These interventions, often described as benevolent modernization, fundamentally altered social structures and cultural practices in ways that frequently persisted beyond political independence. Metropolitan popular culture increasingly reflected a pervasive awareness of overseas possessions. Adventure novels by H. Rider Haggard, G. E. Henty, and others romanticized frontier experiences and military exploits. Exhibitions displayed artifacts, peoples, and products from distant territories, bringing the empire home to the public. Geographic knowledge expanded through improved maps and school atlases showing vast pink-colored territories under British control. Consumer goods like tea, rubber, and cotton directly linked domestic life to far-flung regions of the empire. These cultural manifestations subtly naturalized global dominance within public consciousness, making it seem both inevitable and beneficial. Part 49. Settler societies developed distinctive characteristics during this period. Canada achieved confederation in 1867, followed by Australia in 1901 and New Zealand in 1907. These dominions gained substantial self-government, while maintaining monarchical connections and defense coordination with Britain. However, their development often involved the dispossession of indigenous peoples through combinations of warfare, disease, legal mechanisms, and cultural pressure. The stark contradiction between their democratic self-image and their treatment of indigenous populations created profound tensions that would later require substantial reconciliation efforts. South Africa followed a more complex trajectory. The discovery of diamonds in 1867 and gold in 1886 transformed the region's economy while intensifying competition between Boer republics and British authorities. The resulting Anglo-Boer War, 1899–1902, proved unexpectedly costly in both resources and reputation. Controversial concentration camps, established for Boer civilians, caused thousands of deaths and generated widespread humanitarian criticism at home. The eventual peace led to the Union of South Africa in 1910, which consolidated white minority rule while laying foundations for the later apartheid system. Indigenous populations worldwide experienced this expansion through various combinations of dispossession, adaptation, and resistance. Australian Aboriginal peoples saw their lands claimed under terra nullius doctrines that denied their prior occupation and sovereignty. New Zealand's Maori fought the colonial government in the land wars before losing substantial territories through legal mechanisms. Canadian First Nations faced restrictive reserve systems and assimilationist policies designed to undermine their cultures. These experiences shared common patterns of cultural disruption, resource appropriation, and demographic decline, though with significant regional variations in both policies and indigenous responses. Women's experiences of empire varied considerably across contexts. European women initially remained rare in many territories, particularly in tropical regions considered unsuitable for family settlement. Their increasing presence often coincided with hardening racial boundaries and declining cultural hybridity. Part 50. Organizations like the Lady Dufferin Fund established health care for Indian women, combining humanitarian aims with cultural intervention. Meanwhile, Indigenous women frequently faced dual burdens of both gender and racial discrimination, though some found new opportunities through mission education or urban employment. Economic networks grew increasingly complex. The City of London functioned as the global financial center, handling investments, insurance, and banking services worldwide. The pound sterling operated as the primary international currency, backed by gold. Free trade policies opened markets for British industrial exports while securing raw material imports from the colonies. These arrangements generally advantaged metropolitan manufacturing interests, while orienting colonial economies toward resource extraction and agricultural production for export, patterns that created enduring structural inequalities in the global economy. Communication networks physically manifested these connections. Telegraph cables eventually encircled the globe, allowing London to communicate with distant territories within hours rather than months. Shipping lines established regular scheduled services connecting major ports. Postal systems integrated far-flung regions into seamless communication networks. News agencies like Reuters distributed information filtered through metropolitan perspectives, shaping narratives. These physical and informational infrastructures created an integrated system disproportionately serving central interests, while simultaneously providing tools that would later facilitate resistance to that centralization. Military and naval power underpinned this entire system. The Royal Navy maintained a two-power standard, keeping its fleet larger than the next two naval powers combined. Coaling stations and naval bases provided global reach, allowing projection of maritime power worldwide. Professional armies combined metropolitan regiments with locally raised forces. These military capabilities secured trade routes, deterred rival powers, suppressed resistance, and demonstrated dominance, though their costs increasingly strained financial resources and required careful prioritization as new challenges emerged. By the early 20th century, signs of stress appeared in this global system. The Boer War revealed military deficiencies and generated domestic criticism. Indian nationalists organized the Congress Party to advocate for greater self-government. Economic competitors, particularly Germany and the United States, challenged British commercial dominance. New ideas about national self-determination contradicted traditional justifications for external control. These emerging challenges suggested that the Victorian synthesis of territorial expansion, commercial advantage, technological superiority, and civilizational confidence had perhaps reached its zenith as the new century dawned. The Diamond Jubilee of 1897 marked both the celebration of Victorian accomplishment and, in retrospect, the beginning of a long transition. Colonial troops from across the world paraded through London streets, demonstrating unprecedented global reach. Yet voices like Joseph Chamberlain's already called for imperial reorganization to address emerging challenges. The patriotic confidence of Jubilee celebrations contained undertones of anxiety about maintaining position against rising powers and evolving ideologies. This mixture of triumph and concern characterized the late Victorian relationship with a global project that had expanded beyond anything its early architects could have imagined. World War I would soon test the system's resilience. The global conflict that erupted in 1914 drew on resources from throughout the realm, demonstrating both its reach and the strains of maintaining such vast commitments. Colonial troops fought on multiple fronts, from the Western Front to Mesopotamia, from Palestine to East Africa. The war's enormous costs, human suffering, and ideological challenges would transform the international system and accelerate changes already underway within the imperial structure. This great test would reveal both the remarkable strength and the inherent tensions of the world-spanning system that Victorian confidence had constructed.